It is a great honor that there exists a collection of poems by the founder and father of Persian poetry, and this collection, which is now in your hands, contains all of Rudaki's scattered poems. However, this collection is much smaller than the one centuries ago. This collection owes its existence to the admirable efforts and dedication of the late Professor Saeed Nafisi, and all Persian literature enthusiasts, especially those who admire Rudaki's poetry, should be grateful to him. Rudaki's poetry, with its depth and literary influence, continues to inspire and enrich Persian literature. October 1994. Around 1,140 years ago, in the village of Rudak, near the border of Samarkand, Abu Abdullah Jafar ibn Muhammad was born. At that time, the Samanid kings ruled in Khorasan, and Persian was the common language of the people. Renowned poets and skilled writers such as Abu Shakur Balkhi, Abu al-Muayyad Bukhari, Faralawi, Shahid Balkhi, Abu Shu'aib Saleh ibn Muhammad Haravi, Fazl ibn Abbas Bukhari, San Bukhari, Kabaz Nishapuri and Sipari Bukhari had already made Persian poetry thrive alongside Arabic poetry, which was known for its eloquence. The Samanid rulers awarded poets with valuable gifts, and poets had high status in their courts. They wanted to restore Persian to the esteemed position that the Pahlavi language once had, and the Persian-speaking poets, especially Rudaki, were the champions of this national movement. Rudaki's poetry, with its rich imagery, profound themes and eloquent language, played a significant role in this restoration, elevating the Persian language to a level of respect and admiration that it had not seen since the time of the Pahlavi language. After the fall of the Sassanids, when Persian poetry had lost its former status and respect, the scribe's pen was as powerful as the warrior's sword, commanding authority and bravery. Therefore, when Abu Abdullah Jafar ibn Muhammad passed away on the border of Samarkand, all Iranians, all those who spoke Persian, mourned him. Rudaki completed the work that Emir Ismail Samani had begun with his sharp sword and brilliant pen. To describe Rudaki's status, it is enough to say that he paved the way for poets like Daqiqi, Kasai Maruzi and Ferdowsi, and laid the solid foundation for poets like Ansari, Faraki, Asjadi, Manjik and Nasir Khusraw. Rudaki, in addition to his poetry, was also skilled in music and played the harp well. At the Nasir ibn Ahmad Samani court, no one was more esteemed and respected than Rudaki. Until his death, no one had written as many poems as he had. He had composed over 1,300,000 poems. His collection was like a library. Some of his works indicate that he had composed Kalila and Dimna in verse, and had 4 great Masnavi, long narrative poems, in his name. Unfortunately, almost nothing remains of these works, as the Mongol invaders nearly 3 centuries after Rudaki's time destroyed and burned the great cities of Iran, and Samarkand, Rudaki's homeland, was one of those cities. The loss of Rudaki's works was a significant blow to Persian literature, as his poems were a cornerstone of the language's richness and depth. It is said that the Mongol cavalry would storm the mosques, use Quranic scrolls as fodder for their horses, hand the reins of their horses to the scholars of the time, kill the wise men, and then destroy and burn the entire city. During this invasion, the cherished grave of Abu Abdullah Jafar ibn Muhammad was reduced to dust beneath the hooves of the Mongol horses, just as his collection of poems was destroyed. In fact, with the destruction of Rudaki's precious poems, one of the cornerstones of the Persian language fell. Yet, despite this loss, Rudaki's legacy of resilience and determination lives on. Without a doubt, the Persian language and poetry would have had a stronger foundation and greater richness if his poems had survived. For many years, scholars and lovers of Persian poetry have sought to gather Rudaki's scattered poems into a collection to create a version that, in the words of the late Professor Saeed Nafisi, at least 1/4 of would definitely belong to Rudaki. One of the difficulties in identifying Rudaki's poems is the similarity between some of his works and those of the poet Katran Tabrizi from the 5th century. Both poets have a patron named Abu Nasr Mamlan from the rulers of Azerbaijan, and the other being Nasir ibn Ahmad, the Samani king. As Professor Nafisi has pointed out, in the collection of poems published by Prince Feridun Mirza Emad al-Sultana in the name of Rudaki, 951 of the 1,170 verses are certainly by Katran Tabrizi, and some of the remaining 219 verses are also questionable. To date, the most reliable version of Rudaki's poems belongs to Professor Saeed Nafisi, who collected and compiled nearly 1,047 verses attributed to Rudaki with great effort and perseverance. The poems compiled by Professor Nafisi, published in Tehran almost 70 years ago, are recorded in various Persian books under Rudaki's name. Professor Nafisi also explained the quality of his research and the reasons for selecting these poems in a book titled The Environment, Life and Poems of Rudaki. This present book is based on this version and partly on the edition published by Danesh Publications in Moscow. Rudaki, in the mid-290s, had gained fame as a poet and musician in his homeland, which is now in northern Tajikistan, known as Kashlak Banjarud. Thus, the Samanid court invited him, which marked the acceptance of Rudaki's maturity as a poet. From the beginning, Rudaki sought something greater than the generous patrons of poetry among the rulers and ministers of the Samanid court. He aimed to inspire and strengthen the force that would contribute to creating and flourishing a powerful, independent state that supported the true Iranian culture. Naturally, the life of a poet at the court, interacting with officials and people of power over many years affected Rudaki's writing and influenced his lifestyle. Participating in grand celebrations and revels and composing poetry with commissioned motives was part of the poet's life. These experiences and interactions often found their way into his poetry, adding a layer of social and political commentary to his work. Some of Rudaki's poems are cheerful and spontaneous, written out of necessity. Conversely, many of his poems, especially those written in the later years of his life, reflect incredibly bitter, candid and insightful themes inspired by the poet's soul. The most important and authentic poems of Rudaki were written in the last years of his life. One of these is Kalila and Dimna, which he transformed into Persian verse from the Arabic prose translation of Ibn al-Mukaffa. Unfortunately, only a few scattered fragments of this 12,000 verse work remain, but even these few pieces show how Rudaki used his creative genius to craft this remarkable tale. While maintaining the original narrative structure of Kalila and Dimna, he infused it with his thoughts and poetic subtleties. After Kalila and Dimna, Rudaki composed his longest poem, To His Mother, which poignantly discusses aging, weakness and illness. However, some verses in this work are filled with energy and joy, adorned with various colours. The contrast between the cheerful tone of the initial verses of this work, which describe a wine cup, and his later verses, written in 325 AH, 937 CE, especially his sorrowful elegy for his close friend, the poet and philosopher Abu al-Hasan Shahid ibn Hussein Balkhi, is striking. 1 year after this event, Rudaki was dismissed from the Samanid court and subjected to a cruel punishment common in the East during the Middle Ages. He was blinded. Why this cruelty and enmity? According to Rudaki's contemporary poet, Shahid Balkhi, and some of Rudaki's poems, his affinity for the Karmatians, regarded as heretics, was evident and clear. The religious and philosophical beliefs of the Karmatians combined a free interpretation of religious texts and pre-Islamic ethical systems with some elements of Greek philosophy. Politically and socially, they sought to return to a more communal, agricultural society. Disillusioned by his quest for justice among the powerful rulers of his time, Rudaki, now old and weak, returned to his homeland, Banjarud, and passed away in 329 AH, or 941 CE. Almost 1,000 years later, in 1940 CE, the founder of Tajik Persian literature, Sadr al-Din Aini, based on historical records from Samarkand, wrote that Abu Sa'id Idrisi had uncovered Rudaki's tomb in an ancient cemetery after much effort. In 1956, a scientific team led by the famous sculptor and anthropologist M. Grasimov excavated Rudaki's grave. With the help of anthropological research and the poet's poems, they reconstructed the poet's face, confirming the findings of Sadr al-Din Aini. They concluded that Rudaki's eyes had not been removed, but his head had been placed on a hot coal, gradually causing his visionary eyes to burn out. The fractures in the poet's back and ribs were evidence of the brutal torture he suffered. It is telling that despite his esteemed position at the court of Nasir ibn Ahmad, Rudaki returned to his homeland, Benjrud or Banjarud, at the end of his life, suggesting that the court had either expelled him or killed him. His body was then taken back to his homeland and buried there. The bitter and sorrowful poems Rudaki composed during this time, reflecting on the changing fortunes and suffering of the people, serve as additional proof of this account. Professor Nafisi also wrote that his bones were later found, revealing signs that indicated he had been tortured, his face scorched by fire, and his eyes had been burned out. According to the evidence, his blindness was not congenital, and the circumstances surrounding his death suggest he was blinded in his final years. Rudaki's blindness, myths and realities. Muhammad Aufi, Jami and others believe Rudaki was born blind, but the poet's poems suggest otherwise. The first piece of evidence is the similes he uses in his poetry. The sun rises from behind the clouds occasionally, like a fence that has a passage for the enemy. The tulip smiles in the field from afar, like the hand of the bride dipped in henna. These similes and many others in Rudaki's poetry make it clear that he could see. If he were blind, he would likely have perceived the world as dark and colourless. However, no poem by him supports this idea of blindness. Some, like Sheikh Menini in his historical commentary on Yemeni, argue that Rudaki became blind in his later years due to illness, and his blindness was caused by a procedure called milking the eye. In ancient Iranian medicine, milking was used to treat cataracts called ab forward, by rubbing a heated iron rod on the eye to remove the membrane. Unfortunately, this procedure sometimes leads to total blindness. Another theory suggests that when Rudaki fell out of favour at the Samanid court, possibly due to his association with Abul Fadl Balami, a minister dismissed in 326 AH, his eyes might have been deliberately harmed as punishment. This theory is supported by Rudaki returning to his hometown Panjrudak in his old age, where he was later buried. This exile suggests that the court exiled him after the fall of his patron. Rudaki's resilience in the face of such adversity is truly admirable. It is widely accepted that Rudaki was not blind from birth, but became blind later. The famous poet Daqiqi even wrote, "The great martyr must be alive, and the poet with the dark eyes sees clearly." Similarly, Nasir Khusraw wrote, "He has spoken much of asceticism and wisdom. That poet with the dark eyes sees clearly." In addition, Abu Zura al-Muammari of Gurgan said, "If I do not stay in the service of Rudaki, do not wonder. For I know of Rudaki's words, if I fall into blindness from his eyes for the sake of the world, I cannot be blind." From this we can conclude that there is no definitive proof that Rudaki was born blind. All evidence suggests that he lost his sight in his later years, leaving us with a fascinating mystery to ponder. Family and love. Several verses imply that Rudaki did not have a wife or children in his youth and may have married later in life. In one of his poems, he laments the passing of his youth and the hardships of growing old, saying, "I had no wife, no children, no support." At times it appears that he is complaining about his wife. Comfort and luxury were easy and simple, but one morning my fate changed with a sudden turn. However, love and the praise of a beloved companion form the basis of many of Rudaki's poems, reflecting the depth of his emotions and the power of love in his life. There is no thought except for my beloved. Love has become my guide in the world. From the poetry of some later poets, like Sozani Samarkandi and Adib Saberi Tomezi, it is inferred that the name of Rudaki's beloved was Ayar. According to the scholar Said Nafisi, Ayar was an enslaved person Rudaki bought, and he was indebted for the purchase, with his debt being repaid by Abul Fadl Balami. Rudaki's verse may be referring to this connection. Someone sent a message to my Ayar, "Do not mention me too much in your poems." Music and recitation. In the 4th and 5th centuries, it was common in Iran for great poets to combine poetry with music, reciting their poems in one of the musical modes, or singing them in such a way that others could follow. A great poet could compose beautiful poetry, play music, and sing. If the poet lacked a good voice, they would hire a raw reciter to sing their poems in gatherings. It is noted that Rudaki had a capable reciter named Major Rudaki himself, says, "O Marj, recite my poetry from memory, from me, the heart and soul, from you, the body and voice." The name Marj or Marji is often mentioned in Persian dictionaries as Rudaki's reciter. Some believe it is a variation of the popular name Makh or Mak at the time. Said Nafisi noted that Marj was a specific name used in the past in Iran, and that a market and mosque in Bukhara were also named Major. Wealth and success. There is no doubt that Rudaki reached a high position through his poetry. As Nizami Aruzi mentions in his Chahar Makala, the Samanid government offered Rudaki a reward of 5,000 dinars for persuading the emir to return to Bukhara. After succeeding in this task, Rudaki was rewarded with 10,000 dinars. Similarly, Jami wrote about Rudaki's wealth. Rudaki, who in his poetry praised the Samanids, received gifts worth 400 camels from the court. The history of Sistan states that the ruler of Sistan sent Rudaki 10,000 dinars after receiving a poem from him. Rudaki himself mentions, "The ruler of Khorasan gave me 40,000 dirhams, and from my patrons 8,000 more." From this verse, he rose from poverty to wealth and affluence in his youth. He also says, "Today, with your favour, O Emir of Khorasan, I possess both wealth and a noble countenance." Sometimes there were also gifts from the Emir Khosrow. As it is said in the biography of Rudaki, "If the world ruler does not give a gift, what difference does it make, for I have been promised for 4 years." Muhammad Aufi in Lubab al-Albab, in his biography of Mazi, a famous poet of the 6th century and the royal poet, laureate of the Seljuk court, and his son, Sultan Sanjar, writes, "It is said that 3 poets were favoured by 3 rulers during times of prosperity and acceptance, which others did not experience. Rudaki, during the Samani era, Ansari, during the rule of the Ghaznavids, and Mazi, during the reign of Sultan Malik Shah." In the biography of Abu Zura al-Mamari al-Jurjani, he also writes that the Emir of Khorasan once said to him, "Why do you speak poetry like Rudaki?" He responded, "My poetic style surpasses Rudaki's, but your kindness makes it more evident." Thus, these 3 verses were composed on that occasion. If I were to stand in the same place as Rudaki, do not be surprised. I know poetry just as well as he did. If, like him, I were to lose my sight in this world for the sake of the world, I could not be blind. I have received as much as the king's gifts, and I could compose verses even 1,000 times over. Rudaki's name is at the forefront of Persian poets. Dawlat Shah, in his Tazkira al-Shu'ara, has placed Rudaki at the top of the first rank of poets. Hamdollah Mostofi in Tariq-i Ghazida emphasizes this same point. He is the leading poet of the Persians, and before him, the Persians wrote Arabic poetry. The author of Atashkade writes that Rudaki lived during the Samanid dynasty and opened the treasure chest of Persian poetry. It is said that no poetry was written in Persian before Rudaki, except for a verse of Bahram Gur and a line by Khalaf ibn Yaqub al-Safari. But it is likely that these poems were not recorded due to the dominance of Arabic culture. In any case, poets before Rudaki were not yet recognized as having an official poetry collection. The introduction of Rudaki's Divan, published in Tehran, states he was the first poet after Islam in Iran to have a poetry collection. Although poets like Abu al-Abbas Malwazi, Abu Hafs Hakim Sogdiani, Hanzala Badghisi, and Shahid Balkhi composed poetry before him, Rudaki's poetry stands out due to its eloquence and antiquity. The author of Majma al-Safar argues that it is incorrect to say that Rudaki was the first Persian poet, as poetry, both rhythmic and non-rhythmic, existed in every era and language. Poets in Iran have been composing poetry for centuries, such as Abbas Malwazi, who composed Persian poems praising Caliph Mamun, and Abu al-Hasan Shahid Faravi, who preceded Rudaki in the art of poetry. Rudaki, however, perfected the art and honored the earlier poets, composing elegies for those who came before him. Indeed, poets from the early 3rd century composed poetry in Persian, and if we consider Rudaki's era starting in the mid-3rd century, poets were already active 50 years before him. Nizami Aruzi in his Chahar Makala mentions that Abdullah ibn Ahmad Kujistani had read the Divan of Hanzalah Badghisi, a poet of the early 3rd century and a contemporary of the Al-Tahirid dynasty in Khorasan. Therefore, Rudaki was the first to compose beautiful Persian poetry. The volume of Rudaki's poetry was vast and varied. Rashidi Samarkandi, a poet of the 6th century, wrote in his Sardnama, "If a crown is needed among poets, Rudaki deserves it over all others. I counted his poems 13 times by 100,000, and more could be added if counted as they should be." What is meant by 13 times 100,000 is that it refers to 1,300,000 verses. Some believe that Rashidi Samarkandi's counting was about measuring Rudaki's poetry 13 times by 100,000 verses. This seems unlikely, as no evidence he counted his poetry that way. In his Baharistan, Jami and the authors of Hafiz al-Ulum, Zinat al-Majalis, and Rayhane al-Adab state that Rudaki's poetry reached 1,300,000 verses. However, these numbers seem exaggerated. Poets with prolific productivity could compose 100 verses daily, and writing 1,400,000 verses in 40 years wouldn't be surprising. Evidence from surviving fragments of Rudaki's poetry indicates that he composed at least 220 odes. If each ode contained an average of 30 verses, we would have approximately 6,840 odes alone. Thus, it is likely that Rudaki composed around 13,680 verses of odes. Furthermore, it is known that Rudaki wrote 7 major epics, one of which was Kalila wa Dimna. The Kalila wa Dimna adaptation from Pahlavi into Persian was around 9,000 verses. Rudaki's poem of this adaptation could not have been less than this amount. Indeed, poets do not always keep their verses strictly faithful to the original. They sometimes add or modify them to enhance the poetic flow. Rudaki also wrote the famous Sinbad Nameh in the same meter as Kalila wa Dimna. It is also reported that Rudaki composed the epic Iradi Virafnameh, which was originally in Pahlavi. Each epic or masnavi in Persian literature typically contains 7,000 to 8,000 verses. Therefore, Rudaki added around 70,000 verses to his body of work. Surviving poems of Rudaki. Today, out of the vast number of verses Rudaki composed, only 1,047 verses are attributed to him, including, from odes and fragments, 572 verses. From quatrains, 76 verses. From scattered verses, odes, fragments, ghazals, etc., 177 verses. From masnavis, 222 verses. The Kalila wa Dimna remains an important work attributed to Rudaki. This translation was done by Abu Mansur Muhammad ibn Abdul-Razak Ferdowsi, a prominent figure in the Samanid court. It is said that after Rudaki's death, his name remained immortalized through his translations and poetic renditions of Persian folk tales and other historical